For nearly 2 decades, Ellen DeGeneres was one of the most trusted faces on American television. Every afternoon, she danced into her studio, cracked jokes at her own expense, gave away cars and cash to strangers, and closed the show with the same 2 words: be kind. That phrase wasn't just a sign-off. It became her entire public identity. So when, in the summer of 2020, that identity started to unravel, it didn't happen quietly. It happened in headlines, in tweets, in a cascade of stories for people who had worked for her, and it left millions of longtime fans asking the same uncomfortable question: was any of it real? This isn't a story about a single scandal or a single villain. It's the story of how a brand built entirely on warmth collided with years of accounts from behind the scenes, and how the person at the center of it all chose to respond once the cameras were rolling again. Ellen DeGeneres didn't become one of the most powerful people in daytime television by accident. Long before The Ellen DeGeneres Show premiered in 2003, she had already built a career on being the disarming, self-deprecating counterpoint to a louder entertainment industry. She wasn't confrontational. She didn't chase controversy. She danced in sneakers, laughed easily, and made guests feel like they were talking to a friend rather than performing for a camera. That approachability became the entire architecture of her show. Celebrities who were guarded elsewhere loosened up on her couch. Audience members left with prizes, surprises, and viral moments of generosity that circulated for years afterward. And "be kind" stopped being a catchphrase. It became a promise. If Ellen was involved, people assumed decency came with it. That assumption is exactly why what came next hit so hard. Behind that image, though, was a massive production. At its peak, the show employed more than 1,000 people across nearly 2 decades and produced roughly 3,000 episodes. Running an operation that size meant daily deadlines, constant turnover pressure, and, according to the people who worked there, a leadership structure that didn't always match the gentle tone playing out on screen. The 2020 investigation didn't come out of nowhere. 4 years before it, there had been scattered, disconnected pieces of a story that never quite added up to a headline on their own. In early 2020, Dutch YouTuber Nikki DeGeneres, best known online as Nikki Tutorials, described Ellen as cold and distant during an appearance on the show months earlier. A small comment at the time, but one that resurfaced later as part of a larger pattern. Around the same period, a man who had worked as Ellen's bodyguard at the 2014 Academy Awards spoke publicly about his own experience with her, describing her treatment of people around her as demeaning. Neither story generated much traction on its own. Then came something harder to dismiss, a viral moment that had nothing to do with a news outlet at all. In March 2020, comedian Kevin T. Porter posted a request on Twitter asking people to share the most outlandish stories they'd heard about Ellen being unkind to people in real life. He expected a handful of replies. He got thousands. Within days, the thread had accumulated more than 2,600 responses. Waitstaff, flight attendants, production assistants, and people who'd simply crossed paths with her, all describing moments that ranged from petty to genuinely upsetting. None of it was verified. Much of it was secondhand. But the sheer volume was hard to write off as coincidence. And it created the first real crack in the idea that "be kind" was more than a marketing line. Around the same time, Variety reported that crew members on the show were frustrated and angry over how production leadership had handled the early weeks of the COVID-19 pandemic, saying they'd gone over a month without clear written communication about their hours or their pay. A spokesperson for Warner Brothers Television later said the crew had continued to be paid throughout, albeit at reduced hours, and acknowledged that communication during that chaotic period could have been handled better. None of these individual moments would have been enough on their own to threaten a nearly 20-year brand. But together, they built a kind of quiet momentum, a sense among casual observers that something didn't line up, even before anyone had documented proof. That groundwork is part of why, when BuzzFeed's investigation finally landed that July, it detonated instead of just making news for a day. The public had already been primed to believe it. The public turning point came in July 2020, when BuzzFeed News published an investigation built on interviews with current and former employees of the show. Site index equals 4-1. one current employee, and 10 former employees, all speaking anonymously out of fear of retaliation, describe a workplace shaped by intimidation and inconsistency. Site, some said they'd been let go after taking medical leave or bereavement days to attend family funerals. One employee, who said she'd grown exhausted by comments about her race, ultimately walked off the job rather than continue working there. The racial dimension of the allegations stood out. Site index equals 4-1. A black former employee described experiencing racist remarks and repeated microaggressions during her time on staff. Site, other former staffers echoed similar experiences, describing a set where jokes and comments about race were treated as harmless, even when they clearly weren't landing that way with the people on the receiving end. There was also a recurring detail that struck a nerve with the public. Multiple former employees said they'd been instructed by their direct managers never to speak to Ellen if they happened to cross paths with her around the office. For an audience that had spent years watching her treat strangers with warmth on camera, the idea that her own staff had been told to avoid eye contact with her felt jarring. Crucially, most of the allegations in that initial report weren't aimed at Ellen personally. They targeted the show's day-to-day leadership, particularly executive producer Ed Glavin. But one former employee put the underlying tension bluntly. Site index equals 4-1. If Ellen's name is on the show, she needs to be involved enough to know what's actually happening inside it. Site, that sentence became the crux of the entire controversy. Was ignorance really a defense, or was distance itself part of the problem? In response, the show's 3 executive producers, Glavin, Mary Connolly, and Andy Lassner, issued a joint statement taking responsibility for daily operations and expressing that they were site index equals 4-1. Heartbroken to learn that even a single member of their production family had experienced something negative. Site, Warner Brothers Television, which distributed the show, confirmed it was looking into the claims. The BuzzFeed story didn't stay contained. Within days, Deadline and Variety reported that Warner Media had launched a formal, outside-led investigation into the show's workplace culture, retaining an external consultant to interview current and former staff. It was a significant step, a signal that the allegations were being treated as more than a public relations problem. Then, at the end of July, BuzzFeed published a second, far more serious investigation. This one involved 36 former employees and introduced allegations that went beyond bullying and intimidation into outright sexual misconduct. Site index equals 7-1. More than 10 accusations of sexual harassment and inappropriate touching were leveled at executive producer and head writer Kevin Lehman, who denied any sexual impropriety. Site, additional accusations of inappropriate touching were directed at Ed Glavin, and another former employee alleged that a third producer, Jonathan Norman, had attempted to force himself on him, an account that 3 separate former colleagues said the employee had described to them at the time. Site index equals 7-1. Across its combined reporting, BuzzFeed found that 47 former employees accused Glavin specifically of running the show through daily intimidation and fear. Site. This is the point where the story stopped being about a difficult office and became something much harder to look away from. Just hours before that second, more damning report went public. Ellen DeGeneres sent a memo to her staff. In it, she acknowledged that as the show had grown, she hadn't been able to stay on top of everything and had leaned on others to run it the way she assumed she wanted. Site index equals 7-1. She wrote that she was committed to making sure the problems that had surfaced would not happen again. Site, weeks earlier, in an earlier letter addressing the first round of allegations, she'd been more direct about the disconnect between her stated values and what employees said they'd experienced. Writing that on day one, she'd promised the show would be a place where no one raised their voice and everyone was treated with respect, and that clearly, something had changed. Warner Media's internal investigation eventually concluded that while not every allegation could be corroborated, there were real, identifiable deficiencies in how the show was being managed day to day. In August 2020, the fallout became concrete. Ed Glavin, Kevin Lehman, and Jonathan Norman were all removed from the show. For many former employees, though, the producer firings didn't feel like justice. They felt like confirmation of something they'd been saying for years without anyone listening. Some had raised concerns internally long before any of this became public. Watching leadership only get removed after national media exposure, rather than after their own complaints, left a bitter aftertaste. As one longtime employee told BuzzFeed News at the time, DeGeneres' public apology didn't read as though it had come from her. It read as though it had been engineered to save what remained of her image. The show returned for its 18th season with an on-air apology. Ellen told her audience directly that allegations of a toxic environment had surfaced, that an investigation had followed, and that she had learned things that happened on set that never should have. It was a rare moment of a daytime host addressing her own workplace scandal live, on her own stage, in front of the same audience she'd spent years reassuring. But the damage to the show's business was already visible. Ratings, which had been sliding gradually for a couple of years, dropped further. Advertisers grew hesitant. Bookings from A-list celebrities became harder to secure. The show limped through its final 2 seasons before Ellen announced in 2021 that its 19th season, airing in 2022, would be its last. Publicly, she framed the decision around creative fatigue, telling The Hollywood Reporter that after so many years, the show simply wasn't a challenge for her anymore. But the timeline was hard to ignore. The announcement came less than 2 years after the scandal broke, following a stretch of declining viewership that many industry observers tied directly to the controversy. Ellen mostly stayed out of the public eye after the show ended, until August 2024, when she recorded a new stand-up special at the Orpheum Theater in Minneapolis. Released on Netflix that September under the title For Your Approval, it was billed, including in her own words on social media, as her final stand-up special and a chance to finally talk about it. The special opens with an elaborate sequence walking through her career. Her first appearance on Johnny Carson's show, clip from her 1990 sitcom, the on-air coming-out storyline that once defined her, and finally a staircase lined with old tabloid headlines about her sitcom's 1998 cancellation, before Dory from Finding Nemo appears on a screen to tell her to keep swimming. It's a cinematic, high-production opening, and critics immediately noted the contrast between that polish and the substance of what followed. Throughout the hour, Ellen touched on the controversy in fragments rather than head-on. She described feeling like she'd been kicked out of show business. She talked about being labeled the most hated person in America. She disclosed that she has OCD and ADD, and spoke about needing to heal childhood wounds by earning approval from strangers, framing that several critics read as an attempt to explain her behavior as a boss rather than fully own it. At one point, she said she'd been a very immature boss because she never wanted the responsibility of being one in the first place, a line that drew particular criticism given that she had, in fact, built and run a major production company for 2 decades. She also described enjoying pranks on staff, including a button in her office that triggered fake snakes to drop from the ceiling, a detail some reviewers noted sat uneasily next to earlier employee accounts of a workplace built on fear. The response from critics was largely negative. Variety's review argued that she alluded to being mistreated and pushed out of the industry without ever clearly explaining what had actually happened on her set, calling the special frustrating and a disappointing note to end a long career on. Site index equals 10-1. Rotten Tomatoes' critical summary described it as a jokey non-apology lacking real vulnerability or insight. Site Times Review went further, arguing that DeGeneres offered excuses rather than accountability and never satisfactorily answered why. As the person whose name was on the show, she felt so powerless over what happened inside it. Rolling Stone reported that some former Ellen staffers themselves said the special missed the mark entirely. Audience reaction split more than critical reaction did. Some viewers appreciated her openness about her mental health and her mother's dementia, moments multiple reviewers singled out as the special's most genuine stretches. Others felt the emotional material was being used to redirect sympathy back toward her, at the expense of the people who'd said, for years earlier, that they were the ones who'd been harmed. It's worth being precise about what the record actually supports and where public anger and public defense genuinely diverge, because both sides of this story exist for real reasons. On one hand, site index equals 3-1. The 2020 BuzzFeed reporting documented specific named allegations of racism, workplace bullying,